Readers of First Timothy recognize that it is saturated with terminologies, idioms, and concepts related to heterodoxy, that is, deviation from established doctrine. The earliest interpreters of the letter unanimously received it in this light and deployed it for addressing what they also perceived were crises of heresies within their various contexts. Clement, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Ignatius, and many others, virtually all the fathers who happened to cite or allude to First Timothy did so in the service of engaging heresies of their times. Despite this rich earliest reception history, there is currently lack of agreement among interpreters regarding first of all, the extent to which the letter's preoccupation with heterodoxy controls Paul's communicative agenda. Secondly, how the letter is organized to serve this purpose, if any. And thirdly, the precise integral relationships of some of the statements to this agenda. This presentation attempts to shed some light on these three issues, and it proceeds as follows. After a brief synopsis of scholarship on the role of heterodoxy, discourse on heterodoxy in First Timothy, and an equally very brief account of the context of the Ephesian heresies, I will summarize exegetical analysis of Paul's purpose statements in First Timothy and draw from it the key pillars or strands of his communicative agenda. And then following that, we will try and sum up how the parts of First Timothy fits into the whole. And then I will spend a very brief section reflecting on my personal impression and implication of this for our contemporary reflections on an orthodoxy and heterodoxy. To my mind, the way scholars have approached this issue regarding the role of the discourse on heterodoxy may be categorized into three. Those are labeled as peripheral, those who think of it as partial, and others who think of it as programmatic. Within the peripheral approach are those who consider the denunciations of heretics as was a tool. It's regarded that the author of First Timothy used it only as a tool for achieving other more important authorial agenda. And chiefly, the idea is that the denunciation is employed to delegitimate and or displace rival Pauline enthusiasts. So it is thought that the letter, which is produced after Paul's death, is being produced by one faction of interpreters of Paul, and the denunciation of the heretics is actually aimed as a power play between the inheritors of Paul. Several of these studies employ what we can label as sociological approaches, and they are driven by their inability or the felt inability to pinpoint the identity and teachings of the heretics. And this was a very dominant preoccupation of scholarship in the 60s to the 70s, because the belief then was if we could put a name to the heresy, then we could understand the historical concept. And they were very frustrated by how it has been difficult to do so. But an additional context of scholarship at the time was the view that orthodoxy itself never really existed in the first century Christian era. And there are still many scholars who hold to that very powerful view. They drawn from Hegelian principle that all concepts start with thesis, antithesis before synthesis, and being urged on by revolutions within the social scientists, led by people like Max Weber, and also even outside biblical studies like Pierre Bourdieu and the rest. The idea was that what existed would be what we would call heresies, many heresies, which fought against each other. And then somehow later on, orthodoxy developed and then branded the heresies, the competing views, as heresy. So driven by that opinion, it was clear that studying First Timothy was based on trying to understand the nature of the arguments and the social power play, rather than trying to come to grips with what the author was dealing with. Not all scholars in this group looked at it in this nihilistic manner. So if you look at Wall and Steele's work, they believe that the pastoral epistles were for succession planning. And therefore, even if it was written by Paul, the occupation is how to prepare the next generation to succeed Paul. Perhaps I shouldn't put them in this group and say they are partial, but I think they don't give enough attention to the letter's preoccupation with heterodoxy. So it's fair to leave them where I've put them. So that's the peripheral approach. The occupation with heterodoxy was just part of a tool to achieve a more important agenda. Then there is the partial group. The partial group recognizes that the discourse on heterodoxy was important to the author, but it is only part of the agenda. And a significant group of scholars still believe so, that the more important focus is on ecclesiology, how the church should function, and how pastor or leaders of the church should organize the church to function appropriately. And a lot of the scholars were motivated or impacted by the idea that the letter appears, at least on a literary level or even on the conceptual level, to be somewhat disorganized. Some propose that it's made up of composites of different letters. And the occupation is on attempting to find a genre which would define the letter and also make up the literary structure. Now, you will find my own name in this particular group, just to say that, in the 2016, that was my view, even though what I expressed had to do with the pastoral epistles in general. And I'm saying that was my view in the sense that it was my view that the letter dealt with training of future leaders that Paul had in mind, including Timothy. And I didn't give enough attention to the discourse on heterodoxy. I think that is where my 2016 argument was. The programmatic group, which I now think we should take it more seriously, believe that there was a coherent program. The letter has a coherent program to dismantle heterodoxy and restore orthodoxy. But the approaches are different. So you do have those who approach it by trying to solve the literary structure. By and large, this still remains very difficult because the letter doesn't flow in the logical manner that we are used to in Romans, which a lot of scholars wish all Paul's letters were like that, which actually majority are not like that. But there is this struggle with getting the literary structure. Some focus more in proposing chiastic structures. But even those that are nearly successful, I think they tend to not, they are unable to pinpoint how each of the various subjects that are addressed relate to each other in a coherent fashion. They may succeed in showing some literary relationships, but that is all I think they are able to do. Those who approach it on a rhetorical level, I think, make more sense of the way the letter flows. So O'Donnell's work, for example, worked with the rhetorical attempt by the writer to deal with the kind of problems and situated the letter in a particular genre related to administrative letters and made some contributions. But in the end, how the various theological and pastoral preoccupations relate to each other are not adequately addressed. Kitson's PhD focused only on the first chapter, to be fair, and in the end, she also, it was very useful, but in the end, what she focused on is Paul's attempt to address the false teaching itself and the false teachers, and not enough attention given to the organization of the church, the liturgy, and everything that Paul is also interested in. It doesn't highlight their contribution. And then you do have theological thematic approach. Adelaya Collins' approach is interesting. She believes it is pseudonymous, but what is interesting about it is that she thinks that the letter is addressed to a particular Valentinian cult heresy, and so she tries to build the whole letter together in order to address it, which I don't share that view. Mark Yarbrough looks at the letter from what he called the preformed tradition. That's the term he uses, preformed tradition. And basically he's looking at the trustworthy sayings as a sort of knitting the letter together. But it ends up, though theological in intent, it ends up being a literary structure, attempt to solve the literary structure. I belong to the pragmatic eclectic approach, which looks at all the various concepts and how it will fit together. And I think Taunton's attempt, and he first of all isolates all the particular parts of the letter that address the false teachers, and then he tries to weave them together to try and get a coherent response by Paul. He doesn't give enough attention to how the ecclesiology and the pastoral theology belongs to that, and I think I am building on what he has suggested. So my proposal is this, tentative though, and it looks rather broad, but that is the idea of this presentation, that First Timothy is coherently framed by a programmatic agenda, and that agenda is to restore orthodoxy and orthopraxy in the Ephesian church, to make the Ephesian church orthodox again. And this involves a three-pronged strategy that relate to each other in a cohesive manner. First, dismantle heterodoxy. Two, to institute an empirical, and I will define what I mean by that shortly, empirical ecclesiology, which will maintain that orthodoxy. So we're talking about short, medium, and long-term thought going on. And then thirdly, to nurture a pastoral theology suited for medium to long-term curation of the agenda. So all these things fit together to serve the one programmatic agenda, making the Ephesian church orthodox again. And when I say the approach is eclectic methodology, it is a combination of semantics, i.e. trying to get the meaning of the text within its context, but also pragmatics, what the text is aiming to do or aiming to achieve within that context. So where necessary rhetorical, where necessary theological, whichever is necessary to make sure we answer that simple question: what is Paul trying to achieve with this text, given what we know about the context? Talking about the context, I want us to go back, therefore, and look at what Demetrius, our friendly or not so friendly coppersmith of Ephesus, tells us about the context of Ephesus in the mid-first century. This is his speech. He says, "Man, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship." Now, almost everything that Demetrius says here has been confirmed by archaeology of the recent archaeological excavations of Ephesus. He talks about the economic, the business, the power of the business people, the guilds. He talks about the influence of the Pauline work within the place, persuading people to turn away from it. He talks about the social impact of whatever was happening and cultural impact. He talked about the totalizing control of the Artemis religion in every aspect of life, not only in Asia Minor, but in the then world. And he talks about also the business aspect of it. It's all been borne out by recent archaeological evidence. Will not be able to put the evidence here, but I'm sure you will be able to access those. So we have four distinctives of first century Ephesus to think about as we come to look at First Timothy. The religious, the Ephesus being the sacred home of an international religion, a religion that had spread. There are currently evidence of papyri in Egypt bearing influences of the goddess Artemis. So it was an international one. The temple, after all, was one of the seven wonders of the world. So the religious element, and then the political element, Rome, the Roman imperial capital of Asia, with a system that was meant to mirror what was happening in Rome itself. And it has a lot of confidence, Asia Minor being the competing breadbasket of the Roman Empire. A lot of things were going on. Then you have the economic export city, and the Artemis, the temple itself, served as a center of what we would today call a center of international banking. People will go and keep their precious stuff in the temple and go and collect it in time for a fee. The guilds were influential. There have been enough evidence of very active also culture. The massive library of Celsus, which has been excavated recently, even though it was built in at best late first century and perhaps finished in the second century, bear to that testimony that this was a center of huge intellectual exchange, a pluralistic environment, a multicultural environment. When Luke talks about the burning of magical books, it's not just the magic which had books, and that should also remind us of the philosophical exchange which was going on. It was a very progressive, in that sense, city, Ephesus, in the mid-first century. And it is within this very actively exchange of ideas, multicultural environment, that what we now have come to name as Ephesian heresies, and I prefer that, we know we'll talk about Colossian heresies. It's better to fit heresies to their geography in ancient times because they tend to take different forms when they move from one place to another. What we can tell is a mixture, syncretistic mixture of elements of Judaism, as Paul himself criticizes the interpretation and use of the law in the first chapter. Influence of Artemis cult that no one could escape because it seeps into the culture, economics, as Demetrius bears witness. And then Christian false teaching. Currently, interpreters have tended to use the term realized or over-realized eschatology. And I think it's a good term to use, except that the point that over-realized eschatology is actually quite broad term and so helpful, but it doesn't so precisely tell us what is going on. But you have this sort of syncretistic mixture which was going on in first century Ephesus. Now, when you have this sort of environment of syncretistic deviation from Orthodox teaching, and for now, let's regard Orthodox teaching as the Pauline gospel, because Paul is later on going to characterize what Orthodoxy really meant for him and for Timothy. But deviation from heterodoxy and heteropraxy, what then happens is a socio-theological confusion. I think I would change the term chaos to confusion. Chaos means too much pejoration. And then what that happens, that confusion just gives birth to more false teaching. More false teaching gives birth to more moral relativism that emerges from the confusion and indiscipline in the church. So you do have a very confusing picture where it is not just ideas which are corrupted, but how people behaved and how the church lived, how the church conducted itself. It's all impacted by these three. And if we can imagine that this is the context, then you can then see why dealing with such a mixture, addressing such a chaotic heterodoxy and heteropraxy would require immediate to long-term multi-pronged approach, which is coherent and cohesive at the same time. And this is the basis of my thinking of the pragmatic approach, that Paul would have used all these elements to solve the one problem, but we've got to read it therefore how they relate to each other. How do we see this playing out? Now, an interesting, and I think Paul has helped us a lot with that letter, an interesting feature which is not often taken seriously is there are three occasions that Paul gives explicit statement of his purpose for writing. And they are evenly distributed in the letter. In the beginning, 1 verse 3 to 4. In the middle, 14, chapter 3, verse 14 to 16. And in the end, chapter 6, verse 20 to 21. And that is the point to start with, I think. Now, let's quickly run through this. I hope I will be able to do this justice very quickly. So when we look at chapter 1, verse 3 to 4, I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies which promote speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. They urged you is a very strong terminology that he uses, which emphasizes the pastoral theological task, which will be further defined. Now, remain at Ephesus, the tendency is to think of it as just a statement to explain the separation between the apostle and Timothy. I think it's more than that. The terminology he uses, the prosmenai he uses, has a very strong sense of stay put, remain strong, if you can put it that way, stand up to it. So there is a sense in which Timothy is being urged to stay at a station, to be very resolute to be very resolute at Ephesus, and you can see why he needs to do that. Again, this feeds into a pastoral theological, and we'll talk about the identity formation of Timothy through such devices. And then he defines the task clearly in verse 3, that you may command certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. And this is the definition he gives to different false teaching. It is different from the Pauline gospel. And so his task is to dismantle heterodoxy. He then places the heterodoxy in opposition to the economion theo, the orthodoxy. So within this opening statement alone, we have a clear intention, agenda of the apostle to clarify the type of pastoral theology fit for doing a certain task, which is dismantling heterodoxy and making sure orthodoxy wins a battle that was ongoing in Ephesus. So that's the first purpose statement, and I think I will leave that. And let's look at the second one, which is right in the middle. I hope to come to you soon. And again, he hints about how it's important for Timothy to know what to do. I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. And then he goes on to define the orthodoxy. Now, like many interpreters have grounds to quibble the ESV and NIV and NRSV actually rendering of this term. I mean, behave can be taken to mean is often taken to mean ethical sense. But what Paul is saying here is more than ethical. His mixing of the personal, the singular and the plural, and his immediate emphasis on truth as related the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth, his immediate emphasis on orthodoxy definitely shows that what he is talking about is the better translations, conduct oneself. It's more than ethical. It relates to how you do church. So we could easily put it that way. I'm writing to you these things so that if I delay, you may know how you do church, which after all is the household of God, which is the pillar, which is the church of the living God. So, and this is what I call empirical ecclesiology, fit for maintaining orthodoxy. And that is a self-pronounced purpose of Paul. So one ought to know how you do church in the household of God, if that makes sense, this is what. So empirical ecclesiology commensurate with normative ecclesiology. And I will come to what I mean by these two terms. But let's look at the third one, and he then goes on to state what the orthodoxy is by stating what amounts to the Christ event, the gospel. And then the third one, the third purpose statement, is the final two passages or final two verses of the letter. O Timothy is a rhetorical vocative intended to nurture Timothy's and all the readers' pastoral identity. And he then uses a metaphor of nurturing his pastoral identity, painting him as a steward of orthodoxy. Guard the deposit entrusted to you. A pastoral identity or pastoral theology that is focused on guarding, stewarding the Orthodox doctrine. And then he refers, of course, to the heterodoxy. And some scholars debate on whether by falsely called knowledge, Paul was referring to gnosis. I think he is making the point that the the intellectual exchange of Ephesus was a dangerous climate that he, Timothy, must recognize and see himself as there not to accommodate, not to fit in, but to steward orthodoxy. Dismantling of heterodoxy is made a key preoccupation of pastoral theology. So what we have are these three ideas, and I hope my quick brush through these three passages bear it out. We have these three ideas: dismantle heterodoxy, restoring orthodoxy. One is opposed to the other. So you do one, you aim for the other, and you steward the other. Institute empirical ecclesiology, whose task is to maintain, shepherd, and express this orthodoxy, and nurture a pastoral theology that will be the curator, that will curate these things. So these are not disparate ideas. They fit one single agenda, which is make the Ephesian church orthodox again. Now, what I'm going to do now is to run through a series of very busy slides. I will not give apologies for that because I have supplied handouts which you can look at. But I'm now trying to just give an idea about how all these are reflected in the rest of the letter and how he makes the parts fit the whole. So in between these three purpose statements, Paul characterizes orthodoxy and heterodoxy deliberately. He gives instruction on leadership and how you do church. He then nurtures Timothy's pastoral theology through various means. And the characterization of orthodoxy is done through various means, and I have it there through the highlighting the four coordinates of orthodoxy, what I call the four coordinates he uses. And in fact, if you look at the interesting way the Thanksgiving prayer report of First Timothy is framed, it is a way of stating orthodoxy. As has been always observed, this is the only letter in which, and Second Timothy, and Titus also for pastor, in which Paul's Thanksgiving report is based not on the recipient, but actually on him. But what he does is to explain how his experience of orthodoxy is and gives thanks and praise to God through our Lord Jesus Christ for that. And in this, he lays out the various elements of this orthodoxy. He demonstrates that it's not just mere concept, but how it is exemplified in the life of the apostle and exemplified in a fruit it bears or bore in the life of Timothy himself. He also characterizes heterodoxy, and this is an interesting way. I've borrowed what he does in 2 Timothy 2, 23 to 26 to summarize it, but in fact throughout 1 Timothy he gives vent to a graded fashion of heterodoxy. So there is the bit that deals with verbal speculations, which is often on the personal level. And then there is the emotive, sinful, and interpersonal divisiveness. So he talks about quarrels, which is interpersonal. Then there is the willful defiance and open contradiction of teaching with influence, opponents. And then he goes on to talk about the other grades. And based on these grades of heterodoxy, you can think of a grade of various deviations from orthodoxy, from what Paul discusses in the letter, starting from some intra-orthodox variants, which he doesn't spend time to talk about, which you would understand given the context, but one can appreciate how that is. But then from error to heresy and apostasy, and various methods that he lays out on how to deal with it. He also discusses in the letter the drivers of doxis, the kind of factors which move people from orthodoxy to heterodoxy and the other way around. And I was very impressed to find that many of these could be reflected in the background of the letter. My time says my 45 minutes is up. Am I allowed another few minutes, or that is it?
Yes, please continue
Oh,
and
thank you very much. So take, for example, what he says in 1 Timothy 6, 2-4, where he actually starts by characterizing what Orthodox. If anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ, so the words, the teaching, and later on he speaks about the testimony before Pontius Pilate, all being the Lord Jesus being the grounds of Orthodox, and the teaching that accords with godliness, the fruit. And then he talks about some of the factors that lead people to move away from this, puffed up with conceit and understanding. So it's experimentation driven by pride and conceit. He talks about craving for controversy driven by quest for recognition, and some contrarian schismatic quest for enhanced social status. And I think a surrender to social pressure. Sometimes it is to fit in. That is how people might develop such heterodox ideas. Based on these deviance, you can see how Paul lays out the various procedures that he wanted Timothy to institute to deal with the various levels. So error at personal level, instruction, avoid contagion, interpersonal level, a firmer way of dealing with the church, the one that can pollute the church, you can sense a more firmer, even firmer way of dealing with it. Those that are impacting the witness of the church, public discipline required, and of course, those that are recruiting others, excommunication is used and done. Now, this is my definition of ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the investigative analysis of the divinely designed nature of the church, its sociocultural structures, procedures, and practices to fulfill its missional and apologetic operations in God's world, and reflections on their implications. That is a very long, Asumang-like definition. But you can see that in it, you have two aspects. There is the church as a spiritual organism, which is normative ecclesiology. Is a term that is used by exegetical theologians. And then you have the church as a sociocultural organization, sociocultural structures, procedures, decision-making, practices that has to do with how you do church and so forth and so on. And you can enumerate the various ways in which Paul uses the discourse there to address various aspects, each one focused on how they either prevent heterodoxy. So the bit about social welfare, he actually gave about 3 reasons why the social welfare should be organized the way it does. One of it is prophylactic, just to prevent some people deviating. Another one is corrective, just to put people in the right way so that they will be focused on the gospel and other things that he lays out. I would wish somebody to do a big study on safeguarding in the pastoral epistles. We need it for 2 reasons. It is very topical now, but I'm worried that a lot of the concepts in safeguarding being ideas and policies to prevent abuses in churches and so forth. I am worried that a lot of the ideas are being driven by not by the scripture, but by political and sometimes social considerations. And it will turn around to bite the gospel. There is a lot in the pastoral epistles. 4 verse 1-5, Paul talking about coercion, talking about how people are influenced by demonic forces to do things. And there's another passage in 2 Timothy chapter 3. I really wish we can get people doing more work on it. Say, how does the Bible deal with these abuses as prevention, as treatment, well, no, not treatment, as curative, and as making sure you move the church forward. For Paul, it all fits into the agenda. Then, of course, the gospel-focused, God-honoring worship, which occupies the whole of chapter 2, fits into this agenda. And then these are the various church services. I would just want to make this comment about liturgy, church order, and how it is so fundamental to maintaining orthodoxy. Public worship serves as key vehicle for God's people to bring him glory and thanks, to express their loyalty to the true Christian faith, to proclaim the gospel of salvation, maintain orthodoxy, render their supplication to God, and reinforce their covenantal relationship to him and to one another. Any indication of deterioration of attention to or disinterest in precise expressions of any of its elements is early signs of development of heterodoxy. And this, I think, is why Paul spends quite a lot of time dealing with how you do church as you gather and so forth and so on. It's a big contribution there. About pastoral theology, I think I will like to leave it so we can have more discussions, but I have a summary of scope of pastoral theology based on the definition and how Paul goes about to nurture it. And this has been the commonest way in which the pastoral epistles have been studied, rightly so, but it has often not been taken seriously, its role in making sure that the church is returned to orthodoxy again. It fits into our training curriculum to focus on this with the eye that the serpent is always at the corner seeking to destroy. And we train our teachers and pastors to think about this. Yeah, let me just run to the conclusion. I think I've overrun my time. And this is just summarizing how you can then look at each subsection of 1 Timothy and its relation to Paul's agenda. In a summary, what I have pointed out is that the role of the discourse on heterodoxy in 1 Timothy has been approached in disparate fashion, peripheral, partial, and as a programmatic. And even within programmatic, some haven't been as successful as others. I think a pragmatic approach that takes seriously the context of mid-first century Ephesus and the syncretistic nature of the Ephesian heresies and its broader implication in terms of social and religious will explain why Paul employed a three-pronged agenda of dismantling heterodoxy, instituting empirical ecclesiology, and nurturing pastoral theology, all in the service of ensuring that he makes Timothy makes the Ephesian church orthodox again. I've been blessed in the last couple of years as I've been thinking more closely on the pastoral epistles to watch almost live how heterodoxy has developed in many of our mainline churches here in the UK. And sometimes I fear that I'm rather writing 1 Timothy to suit our time rather than making it speak to Ephesus. But it makes the whole text come so alive when you look at the kind of things that are happening today. Letters that have been put to the back burner of Paul's corpus are now proving to be the kind of letters that we need to look again as to how we go about restoring a lot of our churches, either already deviated or deviating from orthodoxy. It characterizes orthodoxy, characterizes heterodoxy, explains the factors and the drivers which lead and feed this deviation, and makes us integrate all the various parts of doing church to serve those functions. And that's my recommendation. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.